This was the most powerful AMD graphics card in 2013, the legendary AMD R9 290X, and today we want to see how it's holding up in both old and recent titles. In 2013, AMD simultaneously introduced the R7 and the R9 series of graphics cards based on the GCN architecture, which had debuted with the Radeon HD 7000 series. Naturally, there was an improvement in architecture on the R9 290, and the 290X got GCN 2.0, an upgrade from GCN 1.0. The new Hawaii XT chip remained on the 28nm process technology, but compared to the Tahiti, it had an increased number of transistors from 4.3 billion to 6.2 billion, and this affected the power draw and the heat generated, so the TDP was increased to 290 watts. The frequency was now 1 GHz according to the new standard, which had been set by the predecessor in a special version called the HD 7970 GHz edition. And there was also an increase in the number of shading units and compute units, and double the raster operations pipeline. The new flagship could do so much more, as it now had a full 4 GB of GDDR5 memory and a huge 512-bit bus. All this added up to 5.6 teraflops of power when the HD 7970 had only 4.3 teraflops, which meant a 30% increase in performance. The direct NVIDIA equivalent was to become the 780 Ti with 5.3 G-flops once it was released. Naturally, there were innovations in the software part too, with an updated API that wasn't as useful at the time, but later became a powerful foundation for the much more successful Vulkan API that is still used to date, and it also had support for DirectX 11.2, which at the time was the main API. The new AMD flagship was welcomed into the market, as the 780 Ti had not been released yet, and it was rumored to be the new king of gaming, as some even claimed it was going to be a GTX Titan killer, especially in terms of price to performance, as it launched with an MSRP of $550 while the GTX 780 was $650, and the GTX 770 was the only cheaper alternative at $399. NVIDIA saw this competition, and so the GTX 780 Ti was released later that year on November at an MSRP of $699, which lowered the GTX 780 prices to $499, and even the budget GTX 770 to $329, which left the GTX 780 Ti as the main NVIDIA flagship to compete with the main AMD flagship of the time, the R9 290X. Speaking of graphics cards, we have links to some of the best GPUs on offer right now in the links in the description. As you can see, I have the Asus DirectCU 2 version in its original packaging, completely new and intact. The card hasn't been opened once in all 11 years since its release, and it's been waiting to be unboxed for a whole decade, so we will actually be fulfilling its purpose after all these years. Hopefully, she holds up nice. Back then, there were more accessories in the box, and you would get a power adapter from one 8-pin to two 8-pin connectors. You could get some golden stickers to choose from, and even a driver CD, which at the time was standard, but gaming PCs don't have CD drive bays anymore. Now let's move on to the tests. I expect the compatibility with everything to be much easier than the GTX 780 Ti, since AMD drivers are open source. The R9 290X still gets community driver updates that should allow us to launch and even play recent title releases that would not launch on the GTX 780 Ti. Some of the games on my list, like Remnant 2 and Horizon Forbidden West, would not launch on native drivers, and some, like Hellblade 2, would not launch at all, even on community-sourced drivers. First off, starting with a look at the synthetic benchmark tests, namely DaVinci Resolve in superposition. And now, let's move on to the gaming benchmarks where all tests were conducted in 1080p. The first game is Crysis 3, playing on Ultra with 4x MSAA. In one of the most demanding locations in the game, coupled with 4x MSAA, we get 40 to 50 FPS, so an average of 45 FPS, which is very playable considering the demanding anti-aliasing and the game looks its best. The next game is Tomb Raider 2013, playing on Ultra with stress effects and 4x SSAA. The benchmark starts at 36 FPS and ends at an optimistic 60 FPS. Given actual gameplay, you can average around 40 to 50 FPS, which is not bad at all considering we're playing on maximum settings, and you could always optimize some settings to stay above 60 FPS all the time. Watch Dogs was the next game tested on Ultra with 4x MSAA and HBAO Plus lighting. This game sold more than 9 million copies, so it's safe to say it was a success of its time, so it makes sense you would have played it too if you owned an R9 290X, and fortunately for you, it runs really well with averages of around 50 to 55 FPS, and sometimes it even goes beyond 60 FPS, so overall a very playable experience. The next game was Assassin's Creed Unity, playing on Ultra settings with 2x MSAA. Assassin's Creed Unity was a demanding game for its time, but the R9 290X was able to get 30 to 40 FPS with some minor 0.1% lows of 26 FPS, which is not unplayable, but some optimizing would have gained you better minimums and more FPS, so it's not too bad. Watch Dogs 2 was tested next, playing on very high settings. When riding around the city, we got a stable 40 to 50 FPS with averages of 45 FPS, which is quite playable and acceptable on a single player title like this. The next game was Far Cry 4 on Ultra graphics settings. Despite the fact that this launched as an Nvidia sponsored title, the R9 290X gets the job done very well with 70 to 80 FPS with rare minor drops below 60 in some intensive scenes. The next game tested is Battlefield 4 on Ultra. The game looks really good and runs even better with averages of 70 to 80 FPS, and sometimes it even manages to go beyond 100 FPS. However, there are some minor drops in demanding scenes where the FPS drops to 35 FPS, but the GTX 780 Ti had the same issue, so it could more than likely be the game, not the GPUs. The Witcher 3 was another game tested. When playing on high graphics settings, we are getting around 35 to 40 FPS without any major dips below 30 FPS, and the game looks as good as it runs despite being very demanding for its time. The next game is Battlefield 1 playing on Ultra. Radeon and Frostbite work well together. Even when playing on Ultra 1080p, we get 80 to 85 FPS with minor drops, but it stays above 60 FPS at all times. The next game is Quantum Break running on Ultra. The game was originally developed for consoles with AMD hardware, so it's no surprise it runs well on the flagship of its generation. We get averages of 50 FPS, so it's a very playable experience. Next is Shadow of the Tomb Raider on Ultra graphics settings. The game runs really well on Radeon, and all three segments in the benchmarks stay within 50 to 60 FPS, so yes, you can enjoy this game with this GPU. Next game is Far Cry 5 on Ultra. This game runs just as well as Tomb Raider with a stable 55 to 60 FPS, so it's safe to say it's a playable experience. Battlefield 5 was also tested on Ultra. The game runs well with 55 to 60 FPS with minor dips towards 50 FPS, but still playable and enjoyable. The next game is Apex Legends. While landing, we get around 90 FPS playing with competitive settings, which will get you even more FPS while in game with averages of 100 to 120 FPS or more. We also tested Control playing on medium settings. The game runs very well with a stable 50 to 60 FPS without any major drops, which is nice. The next game is Days Gone playing on high. This was another title released on consoles running AMD hardware, and it's no surprise that the game runs well with averages of 50 FPS, which should be enough to get you riding around the map as much as you want and have an enjoyable experience. The next game tested is Cyberpunk 2077 on medium settings. Even without any upscaling like FSR, we get a playable 37 FPS, which is quite commendable compared to the 780 Ti, which could barely get 30 FPS. Once FSR is enabled and set to quality, we can get up to 50 FPS and even 60 FPS in some areas, which is quite amazing for Team Red on this one. The next game is Mafia Remake, playing on high. This classic remastered game gets around 50 to 55 FPS, which is nice to see. Next is Need for Speed Unbound, playing on medium settings. With some help from upscaling using FSR set to quality, we get around 50 to 55 FPS while racing, and everything feels nice and responsive, so a decent experience all in all. The next game is Atomic Heart, set to medium settings. In this game, you will get around 55 to 60 FPS and sometimes even a little more than that, so overall another playable experience. The next game is The Finals, playing on low with FSR set to quality. We get around 60 to 70 FPS out of the card. We do get minor dips to 50 FPS in some action-packed scenes, but it's still a very nice and enjoyable gaming experience. The next game is Counter-Strike 2, set to low with 4x MSAA. The performance here is acceptable, with FPS hovering above 100 FPS, and it stays around 120 to 130 FPS, even in smoke and fire scenes, so yes, you can run CS2 with this GPU and get a playable experience. Doom Eternal is next, playing on high. This is where AMD's Vulkan API comes in handy, as we get 60 to 70 FPS with a very smooth frame time graph, which means with some minor tweaks in the settings, we can get up to 100 FPS or more. Next is PUBG on medium settings. There were no major issues running the game. In flight we get around 100 FPS, and once you're on the ground we get around 80 to 90 FPS, which is very playable. However, I want to note that there were minor stutters and low responsiveness issues which were not a problem on the GTX 780 Ti. Now we can go to the games that would not run on stock outdated AMD drivers but were able to run thanks to the custom community drivers. The first game is Elden Ring, running on Ultra. This was one of the games that would not launch at all on the GTX 780 Ti, but at least we were able to try it on the R9 290X. Playing on max settings, we get around 30 to 35 FPS, and with some optimized settings, you can definitely do better and get high FPS. The next game is Horizon Forbidden West on low settings. This is one of the recent releases that is also quite demanding, so we have to use FSR set to balanced to be able to get a playable 45 to 50 FPS with no visual artifacts or stutters, so it's a win for the R9. The next game is Uncharted 4 on medium settings with FSR set to quality. The game runs really well with averages of 50 to 60 FPS, and sometimes it gets up to 70 to 80 FPS, and the game runs smoothly with no stutters or lag. The next game is The Last of Us on low settings, also with FSR set to quality. This is a visually stunning game that needs to be run on high or ultra to get the best visual experience, but this is an 11-year-old card, so that's already asking too much. We get 35 to 40 FPS with some spikes on the frame time graph, and we do get some stutters and some freezing here and there, but it's acceptable for a decade-old flagship, and you can lock the FPS to 30 FPS and play with a controller to avoid the input latency felt using mouse and keyboard. The next game is Ghost of Tsushima on medium settings with FSR set to quality. This is a freshly ported game from the PS4 that was released this year for PC, but we still get 40 to 50 FPS, which is a smooth gaming experience. Next is Hogwarts Legacy on low settings. Playing without upscaling and using some TAA, we get a stable 50 FPS, but there can be drops of up to 30 FPS in some more demanding areas of the game, but you can always use FSR to get better performance. Next is Remnant 2 on low settings. The game is playable and we get around 30 to 45 FPS, so it's an enjoyable experience given how recent the game is. The only downside is the loss of visual fidelity. Playing on low, that makes this game look like Fallout 3. The next game is Spider-Man Miles Morales on medium settings with FSR set to quality. This is a relatively new game that runs well at 62 FPS on average. This is a very decent playable experience without too many dips in performance, that the game is actually a playable experience with the R9. The final game tested was Alan Wake 2 on low settings. Surprisingly enough, the game does launch, but it's completely unplayable as we can count the individual frames with an average of 11 FPS, so Alan Wake 2 will require a better GPU to give you a playable experience. After all the tests, the conclusion here is simple. The AMD Radeon R9 290X has aged like fine wine, which is custom when it comes to AMD GPUs. Even after 11 years, it can still run a lot of games surprisingly well. Furthermore, it was among the first GPUs to use the Mantle API that helped pave the way for the Vulkan API we know and love, and its support for DX12 has enabled it to remain relevant a decade later despite the lack of official driver support, and since AMD's drivers are open source, this has allowed modders to keep cards like the R9 290X active all these years. Our next video will cover the performance comparison of the R9 290X versus the GTX 780 Ti to see which card aged better a decade later, so subscribe and give the video a like if you want to see the final comparison, and check the links in the description to get a good deal on your next GPU of 2024.